So the warning came on camera in front of reporters, and the president moved past it in 11 seconds. Federal Reserve Chair Kevin Warsh has spent weeks publicly flagging the inflation risk sitting inside the newest round of tariffs on Canadian goods, the steepest the administration has imposed on any country. Those tariffs, 50% on a swath of Canadian imports, took effect within 30 days of being announced, covering roughly $20 billion in goods. The Bank of Canada's own governor has echoed concerns about what sustained tariff pressure does to cross-border price stability. And according to people who track the relationship between this White House and this Federal Reserve Chair closely, the warnings have not meaningfully changed the trajectory of the policy at all. Warren Buffett, watching the exchange play out in real time on financial television, offered a single line that traders have been repeating since. "A warning you don't act on isn't a warning," Warren Buffett said. "It's a headline you've already decided to ignore." When you hear exactly what Chairman Warsh has said publicly about tariff-driven inflation, what the data is already showing, and why this Fed chair of all people chose to say it on camera instead of behind closed doors, you'll understand why economists are calling this one of the clearest public collisions between monetary policy and trade policy in a generation. Hit subscribe because the inflation data from this exact policy is going to keep landing in the coming months, and it is going to keep testing who was right. Let me give you the full context, because none of this started with Kevin Warsh, and it did not start with Canada either. For years, Federal Reserve leadership has publicly warned that aggressive, broad-based tariffs carry a real risk of feeding directly into consumer prices, a warning that predates this administration's most recent Canada-specific actions by years. Jerome Powell, Warsh's predecessor, spent much of his final years as chair repeatedly telling reporters, at press conferences, at the Economic Club of Chicago, in testimony before Congress, that tariff increases larger than markets expected were likely to push inflation higher and growth lower at the same time, a combination central bankers have historically found extremely difficult to manage with the tools available to them. Those warnings, delivered publicly and on the record over and over, drew repeated public criticism from the president, who argued inflation had already been brought under control and that Powell was, in his words, moving too slowly and too cautiously. That tension over Powell's independence became one of the defining fights of the administration's economic policy, and it ended formally with Powell's departure ahead of schedule and the nomination of Kevin Warsh, a former Fed governor known for hawkish instincts on inflation, as his replacement. Most Americans don't realize how closely the market watched that transition for a signal about what would come next. Warsh was confirmed by the Senate in a narrow vote and took office in May, and in his first public testimony as chair in July. He stood before Congress and delivered a message that surprised many people who had expected a more pliant successor. He committed on the record to maintaining the Fed's independence from White House pressure, regardless of what the administration wanted on interest rates or anything else. The Fed, he said in substance, is independent within government, not from it. But that independence has to mean something in practice, or it means nothing at all. The choice of Warsh himself carried its own layer of history that most casual observers missed. He had been a finalist for the Fed chair position once before, during the president's first term, and was passed over then in favor of Powell, a decision some of the president's own advisors reportedly came to regret as the relationship with Powell deteriorated over the following years. Warsh's return to the position, after spending the intervening years as a prominent public critic of what he characterized as excessive caution and inconsistency in the Fed's rate decisions under Powell, was widely read in financial circles as the president finally getting the chair he had wanted from the start. That backstory made Warsh's early public independence all the more notable, because it undercut the simplest explanation for why the president chose him, that he would simply prove more compliant than his predecessor had been. Contrast what many observers expected from this transition against what has actually happened since, because the gap is the whole story. The White House's expectation, according to people who have tracked the relationship, was that a Trump-nominated chair with a track record of criticizing his predecessor's caution would prove easier to align with the administration's preferences on rates and, by extension, easier to keep quiet on politically sensitive subjects like the economic effects of specific tariff decisions. What actually happened is that Warsh, within weeks of taking office, began publicly flagging the same category of concern Powell had raised for years, this time applied directly to the specific steep tariffs being imposed on Canadian goods. Reports have described repeated phone calls between Trump and Warsh since May, contacts that have themselves revived questions about how much daily pressure is being applied, even as both sides insist publicly that independence is being respected. The tipping point, in terms of this becoming a fully public collision rather than a private disagreement, arrived when the Canada tariffs took effect over the summer. 50% duties on a significant category of Canadian goods, layered onto an economy where inflation, by the Fed's own preferred measure, was already running close to double the central bank's 2% target. For Warsh, according to people familiar with his thinking, that was the moment when general concern about tariff policy became something that had to be said specifically and publicly about this specific action, because the inflation data connected to it would be arriving in the following months regardless of what anyone in Washington wanted it to say. Let me walk you through what that public warning actually looked like, because the setting matters as much as the words. Picture the room, a congressional hearing room, rows of cameras at the back, staff aides passing notes along the dais, the chairman's leather folder open in front of him containing prepared testimony that had been drafted and redrafted for days by Fed staff economists trying to calibrate exactly how directly he should name the tariff risk without appearing to cross from economic analysis into political commentary. Reporters in the room describe Warsh as measured, deliberate, choosing his words with the caution of a man who understood that every sentence would be parsed for what it implied about his relationship with the president who had just appointed him. When he arrived at the section addressing trade policy, he did not soften the underlying data. He described, in plain economic language, how the newest round of tariffs on Canadian goods added directly to input costs across several sectors, how those costs were already showing up in producer price data, and how the historical relationship between tariff shocks of this size and consumer inflation gave the Fed little basis for assuming this round would behave differently than previous ones. According to people who watched the exchange in the room, there was a brief charged pause after he finished that portion of his testimony, the kind of pause reporters in the room describe as the moment everyone present understood exactly what had just been said and exactly whose policy had just been publicly, if carefully, criticized by the person the president himself had chosen to install. The president's response, delivered later that same day to reporters gathered for an unrelated event, was brief. He was asked directly about Warsh's testimony and the inflation risk it described. According to multiple outlets that covered the exchange, he acknowledged the question, offered a short answer emphasizing his confidence in the tariff's long-term economic benefits, and moved on to the next question within roughly 10 seconds, without directly engaging with the substance of what his own Fed chair had just told Congress on the record. Committee members on both sides of the aisle pressed further in the question period that followed, and the exchanges there sharpened the moment considerably. One senator asked Warsh directly whether he believed the Canada tariffs specifically, not tariff policy in general, but this specific action, were contributing to inflation readings the Fed was seeing in its own data. According to the hearing transcript, Warsh did not deflect. He confirmed that producer price data tied to the affected import categories showed measurable upward pressure consistent with the tariff's implementation timeline, and that the Fed's models had incorporated that pressure into its near-term inflation projections. It was a careful answer, hedged with the technical qualifications central bankers use, but it left little ambiguity about the underlying conclusion. The tariffs were showing up in the numbers, and the chairman was willing to say so under oath, in public with the cameras running. The aftermath moved through markets in Washington simultaneously. Bond yields ticked up in the hours following the testimony as traders recalibrated expectations for how long elevated rates might need to persist if tariff-driven inflation proved as sticky as Warsh's remarks suggested. White House officials in background conversations with reporters emphasized that the president respects Warsh's independence and gives him, in the words of one spokesperson, the space he needs to restore confidence and competence in Fed decision-making, language that several economists noted carefully avoided actually disputing anything Warsh had said about the tariffs themselves. Congressional Democrats seized on the exchange as evidence that the administration's own hand-picked Fed chair no longer believed the administration's messaging on tariffs and inflation. Republican allies of the White House, for their part, largely avoided directly rebutting Warsh's economic analysis, instead redirecting toward the argument that tariff revenue and long-term manufacturing gains would eventually offset any near-term price pressure. Behind the public statements, according to people briefed on internal discussions at the Fed, there was a recognition that this dynamic, a Fed chair publicly and specifically warning about a president's own signature trade policy without softening the message for political comfort, was almost without precedent in recent decades. Previous Fed chairs facing political pressure over interest rate decisions had generally kept their disagreements framed in general economic terms, avoiding language that named a specific administration policy as directly responsible for inflation risk. Warsh's decision to be that specific, according to people who know him, reflects both his own economic convictions, formed over years of criticizing what he saw as excessive caution from his predecessors, and a calculated bet that credibility with markets required saying the uncomfortable thing plainly rather than diplomatically. Warren Buffett's fuller analysis of the moment reframes it away from the political theater and toward the economic mechanics underneath it, which is where he has spent 6 decades building his reputation. In his view, Buffett has said, the significance of this exchange isn't really about whether Trump and Warsh get along personally. It's about what happens when a country's monetary authority and its trade policy are pulling in opposite directions at the same time. One, trying to cool an economy running hot on inflation, the other actively adding new cost pressure into that same economy through tariffs. Buffett's economic translation is direct. Tariffs function, in effect, as a tax passed through supply chains onto consumers, and no amount of White House messaging changes the arithmetic of that pass-through once the tariff is actually in effect and goods are actually crossing the border at the new higher cost. A Fed chair's job in Buffett's framing isn't to make that arithmetic more comfortable for elected officials. It's to say what the data says clearly enough that markets can price it correctly, regardless of who finds that inconvenient. The historical parallel Buffett has drawn on goes back to some of the most consequential monetary policy fights of the 20th century, moments when Fed chairs faced enormous political pressure to keep rates low or keep quiet about inflation risk for the sake of a sitting president's political fortunes, and the ones who resisted that pressure, however uncomfortable it made their relationship with the White House in the short term, were the ones history ultimately credited with preserving the institution's credibility. The universal principle he extracts from that pattern is simple and, in his telling, nearly universal across every institution he has watched over his career. The moment a leader starts saying only what the person above them wants to hear, the information flowing upward stops being useful, and every decision made on top of that information gets worse. His verdict line on this specific episode has already been repeated widely across financial media in the days since. Ignoring a warning doesn't make the warning wrong, Buffett has said. It just means you'll find out you were wrong on a slower schedule, and usually a more expensive one. There's a detail from the confirmation process itself that reads differently now than it did in January, when Warsh was first nominated. During his Senate hearings, Democratic senators repeatedly pressed him on whether he had made any private commitments to the president regarding future rate decisions in exchange for the nomination. Warsh, under oath, denied that any such commitment had been made, and emphasized that central bank decisions had to remain unharnessed to politics if they were going to retain any credibility at all. At the time, that exchange was treated largely as standard confirmation hearing procedure, the kind of assurance every nominee gives regardless of what happens once they're in office. In hindsight, according to people who watched both the hearing and the subsequent tariff testimony, that exchange looks less like procedure and more like an early public marker Warsh set for himself, one he appears to have felt bound to honor even when honoring it meant contradicting the administration that appointed him. Now let's talk about where the consequences of this actually travel, because a public rift of this kind between a Fed chair and a president rarely stays contained to one hearing room. Economically, the most direct exposure sits with American consumers and businesses already absorbing higher costs on Canadian imports, from machinery to electrical equipment to a range of manufacturing inputs that ripple through supply chains into finished goods on store shelves. if Warsh's inflation read proves accurate in the coming months of data. The Fed faces a difficult choice between holding rates higher for longer, which slows growth and raises borrowing costs for everything from mortgages to small business loans, or cutting rates into a period of tariff-driven price pressure, which risks entrenching inflation expectations for years. Politically, the episode complicates the administration's economic messaging heading into future elections, because it is difficult to simultaneously claim inflation is under control while your own Fed chair publicly identifies a specific administration policy as a live inflation risk. The generational dimension of this story deserves attention too, because the Americans watching this exchange unfold most closely, savers and retirees living on fixed incomes, feel Fed credibility differently than younger households do. For someone managing a retirement portfolio built around bonds and predictable income, the Fed's inflation-fighting credibility isn't an abstraction. It's the difference between a retirement income that keeps pace with rising grocery and utility bills and one that quietly erodes year over year. That demographic lived through the high inflation years of the late 20th century and remembers, more vividly than most, what it costs when a central bank loses control of price expectations and takes years to claw them back. For them, the specific question of whether this Fed chair's warnings are being heard isn't political theater. It's a direct read on whether their savings are protected by an institution still functioning the way it's supposed to. There is an institutional dimension here that matters beyond this single hearing. Fed independence has functioned for nearly a century as one of the quiet structural pillars of American economic credibility internationally. The assumption among global investors and trading partners that U.S. monetary policy decisions are made on economic data rather than political convenience. Reports of repeated direct phone contact between the president and the Fed chair since Warsh's confirmation have already revived questions among economists and former Fed officials about whether that independence is being meaningfully preserved or simply performed publicly while different conversations happen privately. Every foreign central bank and finance ministry watching this relationship unfold is drawing its own conclusions about how much weight to place on the Fed's public communications going forward. And that credibility, once questioned, is difficult to fully restore even after any specific dispute resolves. The irreversibility here isn't about a single tariff or a single hearing. It's about precedent. Once a Fed chair has publicly, specifically named a president's own trade policy as an inflation risk and been effectively brushed past in response, the next Fed chair and the one after that inherits a changed set of expectations about what public candor from that position looks like and what it costs. Markets will remember over the coming rate cycles whether specific public warnings from this chair have proven predictive, and that track record will shape how much weight traders assign to his statements going forward for as long as he holds the position. So where does this leave things? Three numbers anchor this story and are worth repeating because they will keep appearing in the coming months of economic data. The 50% tariff rate now applied to a major category of Canadian goods. The $20 billion in Canadian imports directly covered by the new duties. And the roughly 2-to-1 gap between current inflation measured by the Fed's preferred index and the central bank's long-standing 2% target. A gap that existed before the specific tariff round and that Warsh has publicly said these tariffs are unlikely to help close. Those three numbers, the tariff rate, the dollar figure, and the inflation gap, are the plain arithmetic behind a warning that was delivered clearly, in public, on the record, and that the moment required roughly 10 seconds to move past. The philosophical verdict here isn't really about Kevin Warsh, or even about Canada. It's about what happens inside any system, a company, a government, a family, when the people whose job is to tell an uncomfortable truth learn that the truth will be heard and set aside rather than heard and acted on. That pattern doesn't announce its cost immediately. It shows up months and years later in decisions made on incomplete information because the people closest to the real information stopped believing it mattered whether they spoke up. What happens over the coming months as inflation data connected directly to these tariffs continues to arrive will determine whether Kevin Warsh's public warning gets remembered as the moment he established genuine independence from this White House, or as the first of many warnings this administration chose not to hear. Either way, the data doesn't negotiate, and it doesn't wait for anyone in Washington to be ready to listen.